So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, and I'll just walk through a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. We had done a study for sustainable conservation. I see Kelly McCann, one of the project managers, is on, and Daniel Mountjoy was also deeply involved in that, and he's been on several of these presentations, and it was funded through the Resources Legacy Fund as a series of studies of looking at LunchMAR a few years ago. We had in that study, we addressed questions about who are the, what are the benefits of the program. So there's a wider range than what people initially think, and who are the beneficiaries. And then we looked at the question of tying financing of these programs to those beneficiaries. How might you be able to raise revenues to pay for this kind of program? And you would be using those revenues to basically provide incentives for participants to enter into these on-farm programs and be able to recharge locally in these sources. So I'm going to walk through, it was a series of memos that we did. I'm going to walk through some of these, and I'm going to spend some more time talking in particular about the incentives, providing the incentives for participants in these programs. Just to start, we had initially done a study looking at a series of potential configurations for on-farm recharge projects of varying sizes, usually 40 to 160 acres. Some of this was using work done by Phil Bashan, who I think he did a presentation, but I know he's been on these LunchMAR programs as well. And we found that in our study that these types of projects could cost as little as $64 up to $120 per acre foot of reclaimed or percolated water, which was quite low compared to other storage options. And when we looked at the Kings Basin, we looked at what it might cost in order to what the cost would be and what the benefits would be for this kind of project. And just in terms of reduced pumping costs, we were finding benefits as much as $82 an acre foot. But that's really only a small part of what the potential benefits are. There are other benefits that we can talk about, such as increased water storage in other locations, deferred surface water value in the future, flood control benefits, ecosystem benefits. And all of these are benefits that are potential actual funding sources for this kind of project. So we spelled out what the universe of benefits were, and I provided in the study that we did this schematic that shows that we have here the floodwater diversion on the on-charge recharge program, and we think about the local benefits of improved groundwater pumping. But there's other benefits as well, such as the ecosystem benefits, where you have improved habitat, or you have other upstream benefits and downstream benefits. The upstream benefits resulting from reduced flood control space in the upstream reservoirs. That can increase your summer water storage for delivery to other customers, or it can even increase your hydropower production, particularly during the summertime when it's most valuable. And then you have reduced downstream flood risk, which can reduce economic disruptions and can provide additional ecosystem benefits as well. And we can look at another drawing of how this all works, where we have, particularly with the introduction of forecast-informed reservoir operations, or FIRO, that you might have been reading about, you're able to look at how can you change reservoir operations based on the fact that you have increased floodwater capture capacity downstream, that you don't need to rely solely on your reservoir in order to provide flood control benefits downstream. And so that can result in the increased storage that is a benefit to those to other entities that are outside of the groundwater basin that that you may be managing with this type of project. So we can then go in and look at the benefits and break them out in a number of different ways, whether they're direct benefits such as reduced or improved groundwater pumping, or indirect benefits, which are improved hydropower generation, or even ecosystem benefits. You can have primary benefits to the farmers, secondary benefits to the surrounding economy. You have private goods such as agricultural production, or public goods, which are increased ecosystem habitat, tangible benefits, which are physical benefits, and intangible ones such as reduced risk. And so we went through and looked at the benefits that are identified in Sigma related to surface to groundwater pumping. And we also looked at benefits related to flood control. And all of these kinds of benefits are ones that you can look at and ask the question, how do these beneficiaries participate in this kind of project? And so at this point, I actually want to open up a survey to ask, for the types of projects that you're working on, what kind of benefits might you identify with those kinds of projects? And so we're going to put up the survey on the next slide, I believe, if that's right.
All right, I've launched that poll question, Richard.
So you can look through this, and people can answer their question about pick how many of these types of benefits that you're finding as identified in your particular LunchMAR projects that you've been working on. And when we get to the end, we can talk some about these benefits further in the discussion after the presentation. Okay, and it looks like pretty much we're done with that. And the big ones were downstream flood protection and increased upstream water storage. So, so we can skip that and skip on to the next couple of slides. So now that we've looked at the question of beneficiaries, one of the things that we had done previously for the Delta Protection Commission, it's come up in CalFed financing questions and other things, is how do you link financing with beneficiaries? On the premise that the premise of the beneficiary pays principle. That is that beneficiaries should be paying in some proportion to the benefits that they're deriving from a particular project. And so we went through the exercise of identifying the beneficiaries and then looking at the question of what are the types of financing mechanisms that you can tie to those beneficiaries in order to collect the benefits that you've identified. So we looked at the different beneficiaries. For example, you have in-basin growers who are using groundwater, or downstream communities that are worried about flood protection and protecting their local economy. You have ecosystem habitat, and you even have out-of-basin water exporters who are using the upstream surface water storage. And so there's a range of different financing mechanisms available. The ones that are often tapped are assessment districts and also state bonds. Those seem to be the two big ones that people identify. But in fact, what we did is we found in a couple of different studies that there's up to 50 potential different types of financing mechanisms that are available in California. And they have different ways that they're tied to beneficiaries and to financing. They have certain restrictions that arise in the state constitution about which ones you can use in what context. But they are creative ways to spread the cost further and more accurately among beneficiaries than just a straight up assessment district combined with a state bond. So when we looked at this more closely, we looked at, for example, in local benefits, there's local pumping fees, groundwater pumping fees, or having groundwater banking and trading with a surcharge on the trades, or actually having actual banking paid for by the local beneficiaries. You can have water supply reservoir payments or a fee on electricity generated from a hydropower facility. You can have downwater flood protection fees of various kinds that can be financed through different types of districts, or you can have ecosystem payments. We also looked at the California climate investment funding through the state carbon fee revenues, or even having environmental bonds such as those that are promoted by the Blue Forest Fund. So I'm going to open it up to another survey where we're going to ask the question, what kinds of financing mechanisms have you been working on related to funding your program? So it's looking like not as much activity on this one as on the previous survey. We're still getting a lot of have not considered yet. A lot of people not at that point in their work. And then some groundwater fees, a lot of grants. Looking for grant money. Okay, so we'll end the polling with that and move on. So the next section I want to talk about is how do you get farmers to participate in this kind of program? And it's actually a multi-part, multi-step process. It's not that you just declare a program and hope that the growers show up and start building diversion structures to accept floodwater. You actually have to walk through this in a number of different ways, and how you design this will affect how often they participate or how much they participate and how successful your program will be over time. So the first step in looking at your incentive program is how do you select the farmers who are going to participate? There's a range of different ways to do it, and they can range from basically having unlimited participation, which is all comers who have access to floodwaters within your bases are able to participate. But at some point, you're likely that you're going to have more, get to a point of either not having enough funds or not enough demand for floodwaters or sufficient floodwaters to have that kind of unlimited participation. So in that, you can have different ways of selecting from the subset of growers who are interested. You can have a lottery system where you just randomly select the growers who want to participate. And that's been done in a couple of pilot programs up to this point, but it's probably unlikely to be a sustainable type of operation. You can have first come, first served, or a queuing process of signing up. you can have what's called a scored subsidy. That is that you weight the participants by the desirability of their land for doing recharge, both in terms of how much flood water they can absorb, but also with other attributes such as, do they provide other ecosystem benefits, or are you trying to diversify the amount of recharge across a broader subset of growers? And then finally, the last one that economists love, which but isn't always the best one, is an auction-based process where you can either have a district basically stating that they'll pay X amount of dollars for a certain amount of floodwater to be diverted, or acreage offered up for diversion. Or you can have growers basically offering a price to accept floodwaters in a what's called a reverse auction. And so those are just a couple of different mechanisms for doing this sort of selection process. And out of this, we get to the question of how do you price the participation in the program. And one type of process or pricing mechanism is to offer a uniform price. So, of course, we're all very familiar with uniform price. When we go shopping, we all pay the same dollar per pound for apples. And that's one type of uniform price. Or you can have out of an auction, you can just pay the highest price or the second highest price that's been offered or demanded in an auction. In the scored subsidy, you can have different prices for different types of attributes, or as I mentioned, you can have a reverse auction, or you can have a discount factor that rates the land by basically how important it is to the recharge process. And there are some types of other types of environmental attribute auctions and programs that are priced with discount factors in them. So that is how you might price it. And then there's the question of, once you've determined a price and they are participating, how might you pay the participants? The first way is just a classic cash payment. A check is sent on a per acre basis for participating. Or you can have a fee rebate, so a reduction in a GSA's pumping fee. Or you can have an allocation of pumping rights or other tradable credits within a GSA, so that they are able to generate revenues from their participation in transactions with other growers within the basin. Or you can have other options of how you enroll growers. So one is a two-stage enrollment, which is you have an initial low fee to offer up your acreage to be considered for participation in the program. And then when the program opens, say in January, once you know what type of water year you're going to have and whether floodwaters are going to be available, you can then make a second payment for actually participating in the program in the next several months when water is made available. So the next thing that you would be thinking about are some of the other issues that are related to these kinds of programs. So one of them is monitoring, determining if growers are actually diverting the amount of flood water that you think meets the requirements of the program. There's other complementary market requirements, such as how is the GSA structured? What other types of market structures do you need in order to make a market function? What kind of legal rights are involved with this type of program? There's also land rental complications that might arise, both in terms of if you are working with tenant farmers, and also restrictions on use of land by the participants whether they are able to enter their land at different times of years and what type of activities they're able to undertake while they're participants in the program. And then finally, there's the larger bugaboo of transaction costs. That is that it always costs you something to participate in markets. And the question is whether those costs of transacting are so large that they cause you to decide not to participate in a program. The one of the transaction costs that many of you have probably encountered is the real estate agent fee of typically around 6% that adds to your price. It's not in the price of your house, but it's something, a transaction cost that you have to incur. So with that, I wanted to move on to a third survey. What kind of actions are you considering to draw participants to your program? And you know, I'm not sure that how many of you actually have gotten this far down the road to think about this, but we'll see from our answers. I'll be interested to hear from the people who have considered other alternatives for participation incentives. Could be an interesting discussion. Okay, and it looks like we have probably have all of the answers we're going to have, and the leading one was that people haven't yet considered these kinds of incentives in their programs. So with that, move on to our the next question, which is near the end, and I'm going to leave a fair amount of time for discussion here. Is what sort of things that I think are important for moving forward on LunchMAR programs, where which are I'll call them non-engineering questions. That is that there's been a lot of focus on the recharge capabilities within potential basins, but I think that we also need to start thinking about other considerations of how to make these programs effective, including how do we attract more participation by growers in recharging their basins. And one of the first things that I think that we need to do is just plunge in and implement some pilots where we focus on different types of institutions, market institutions or other incentives, and look at their relative effectiveness. So there are some, for example, I know that Nature Conservancy is looking at merging the bird returns program in the Sacramento Valley for doing this kinds of recharge. And I've heard of a couple other ones. I think what we need to do is a wide range of experiments. And basically, I think the one question that probably needs to be answered is the water rights question about being able to access excess available floodwaters. But if we can get some sort of a release from the state water board that allows for running short-term pilots for these kinds of programs in these situations so that we can test these things out. That would probably be the best thing that we could do at this point. And I don't think that we really need to worry about what is the effectiveness of the recharge in the basins that we're looking at. That the effectiveness is not what we're measuring in terms of how much water is actually captured. We're actually testing the effectiveness of getting participants in these programs that we can then extrapolate to other locations. The second thing is to look at how we can integrate the new FIRO flood management approach to optimize storage in this situation? Can we use a better understanding of downstream flood capture capacity to be able to more finely manage our storage optimization? And that optimization can probably generate a lot of benefits. If we can avoid having to do floodwater releases in March and instead or actually I should say releases in January in anticipation of floodwaters in March, because we know that we are able to accommodate a lot more floodwater downstream. That's going to leave a lot more water for us to use later in the year when it's most valuable. And then finally, we need to do a deeper dive into what are the feasible financing mechanisms, both from a financial standpoint and from a political standpoint. There are many of these financing mechanisms that economists find attractive, but are not necessarily politically attractive for a variety of reasons. And so I think that what we need to do is to really prepare and look at these more closely so that people have a better list from which to draw from when they want to look at how do they want to finance these kinds of operations and these kinds of projects. And so with that, I'm going to just wrap it up. Here's a link to our report that's the memos that are compiled and are linked. And you can use probably either one of those links in order to get to the study, which has more detail on these various issues. And so with that, I want to open it up to questions from the audience.
Thanks very much, Richard. Great presentation. We invite people at this time to turn on their cameras, turn on their mics, and join the conversation with their questions and thoughts. I've been monitoring chat, and so I can read the questions that we received in chat, or I invite the folks to turn on their mics and join the conversation. So I'll give folks a minute to use the raise hand function or unmute themselves so we can see who is in the queue for questions, but I'll start with a question from Emmanuel. And so the question is, have you looked at equity and distributional issues associated with your study, or would these be covered under secondary benefits? Correct me if I'm wrong. If this seems that you're focusing more on economic efficiency benefits.
So we were focused on the first cut at economic efficiency benefits, which is clearly not the sole set of benefits. As I've actually been exploring this in other areas about the importance of looking at equity and distribution as well as efficiency. And this really was about the first hurdle of just getting growers to be interested in participating in this particular program. I think that would be having a wider reach is one of those things that you would want to do, and that's where I had briefly mentioned that in doing a scored auction where you want to look at a range of attributes. You could include those kinds of equity questions in your looking at who would be participating in such a program. So for example, you couldn't have one grower who puts in 1,000 acres and basically absorbs all of the floodwaters that you have diverted for this purpose. You could have an allocation of floodwaters. You could have a limit on the number of amount of acreage of growers, and you could limit to the type of growers. You could have an allocation for tenant growers within your district who are participating. So there's a range of different things that you can do to accommodate these kinds of equity and distribution goals in your in these kinds of programs. But we didn't really go into that because that would be, I think that's the next step, a natural next step for this kind of work.
Yeah, thanks. Emmanuel had a second question. You mentioned market incentives to incentivize farmers' participation. What are your thoughts about non-market incentives?
So that's also, I think that it can be useful. One of the things you have to think about is the question of, does it cost growers something to participate in these kinds of programs? I think that ultimately, in some ways, the incentives all roll back to being non-market or being market incentives in some way, because it ends up that you have to make some kind of payment. It may be a non-monetary payment. So, for example, an allocation of pumping rights that can be then translated into some sort of monetary realization on the part of the growers. So I think that there's different ways of doing that. You might have something where a district imposes a requirement that growers accept a certain amount of floodwater on their farms. I think that you might find that there's a fair amount of resistance to that type of program. And it also would be probably difficult to tailor that kind of program in a way that you're actually getting the best land that's available for doing your recharge program and meeting your multiple program objectives. So, it's probably worth a greater discussion about what those non-market incentives might look like. But we haven't really dug into that one as much.
Great, thanks. I've got another question in the chat. Again, anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or turn your camera on or unmute yourself and we'll get you in the queue. The next question in chat, I just scrolled away from it. Here we go. Is there a $1 per acre foot recharged value that is comparable to the value of producing crops on that same parcel in a year instead?
So one of the things I think I mentioned was that the pumping cost savings from just looking in the Kings River Basin was around $80 an acre foot. You can look at a couple of studies that were released last year by PPIC and another one done by a similar set of researchers at UC Davis, and a third done by David Sunding and David Rowland Holst that got a lot of publicity about the effects of climate change on agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. And once you dig into those studies, you find that the range of income value that is associated with those with agricultural activity in the San Joaquin Valley ranges from about $500 to $4,400 an acre. And if you simply divide by 3 as a very heuristic rule of thumb about how much water per acre how many acre feet per water you would need, that would be somewhere in the range of 200 to how much do I say? $200 to $1,400 an acre foot in terms of agricultural value that is associated with water production. So this becomes important when you're looking at the sigma restrictions, because that is telling you that you have a willingness to pay to keep acreage production going that is ranging from upwards of a couple $100 per acre foot. And as we looked at in terms of the cost of doing these kinds of programs, typically you can probably do them for well under $200 an acre foot in order to recharge and maintain more ground capacity for groundwater pumping. under the new restrictions that are in place.
Great, thank you. Not seeing any more questions in the chat or from our participants, so I'll ask a question. While we've been kind of considering FloodMAR projects and back in 2017, 2018, we talked about the potential public benefits of FloodMAR projects and also the private benefits, but we focused on public. And some of those public benefits that we identified are in categories that have historically been really hard to monetize. And so I'm wondering if there's been in progress in monetizing benefits like ag land preservation or water quality projects for disadvantaged communities, land subsidence, climate change adaptation, just things that we know are really good to pursue as part of benefit packages for FloodMAR projects, but have historically been things that weren't monetized and just described, but looking for opportunities to expand financing mechanisms and potentially bring in new funders, the federal government into supporting FloodMAR projects. How can we monetize or think about monetizing these more difficult benefit areas?
So there are methods of monetizing many of those things, but it's actually going to take some funding from the probably state agencies in order to develop ways of monetizing those. They're not values that are just sitting out there for somebody to go grab. It actually needs some work in order to do that sort of thing. So for example, disadvantaged communities would be to go in and determine the cost of drilling new wells or chipping in water and determining that valuation. It's not that it takes a lot to do that sort of thing, but it needs somebody to basically step up and do that types of monetization. Valuing climate adaptation, there is work that's being done on that in climate action plans. We are actually working for the Delta Stewardship Council on a project to look at the value of adaptation within the Delta to sea level rise and to changes in water supply availability. So that's a next phase study that we're starting up in that area. That's where I actually why I knew about the value of impact of climate change on agriculture, because we pulled out those values for doing that study. So there are those things out there. It would be good to have the compiled list and then have somebody basically say, okay, I'm going to hire somebody to go do this work and pull out those values. That's what you need to have happen. And the fact is that it really isn't going to cost that much to do that kind of work. In some ways, I think that it may actually be more valuable to do that than some of the refined engineering studies that we spent on FloodMAR, because we're not going to have FloodMAR projects until we figure out what the value is of FloodMAR projects. And we need to have a more complete universe of valuation so that we can move forward on this.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions have come up in chat. What are the economic benefits of doing recharge on farm versus dedicated recharge benefits?
So there's two actual benefits. The first one is dedicated recharge programs have a natural size limit. You can't basically convert all of your farmland to a dedicated recharge basin, because then you won't have any farmland to use the water that you've recharged. So there's a natural limitation, and having dual purpose use of water is or of land for this purpose really expands your potential capacity for doing recharge. It's useful to remove that limit. The second thing is when we looked at the relative costs of the different projects, and we discussed this more in our report, it's actually cheaper to do on-farm recharge because in most cases, they're already connected to canals, and the canals are not being used during the wintertime. So that you are then able to divert the floodwater down the canals, and then you just have to do some extra earthworks and perhaps adding some pumping, temporary pumping facilities in order to flood your fields. And that's where we were finding costs well under $100 an acre foot for those types of on-farm recharge projects. That's really quite cheap in comparison to looking at a lot of other storage options. So that's the, I think those are the two main reasons why you want to do on-farm over dedicated recharge basins.
Great, thanks. And a final question I see in chat. Is there a danger here that we get stuck doing things that make financial sense as opposed to doing things that are needed regardless of the cost? The public sector to an extent exists because some things don't make a profit.
Right, so yeah. So I agree with the part that we need to look at things that don't make a profit, but on the other hand, unless something is a existential threat to life on Earth, there's really is something that is a cost limit that we cannot just say that we're going to do something regardless of its cost. We always have a limit on how much we're willing to pay to do something. And so we have to make that choice about at what point do we decide to stop investing resources in something. But that doesn't mean that you can't look at the question of what are the public benefits of something. That's why I bring up, for example, ecosystem benefits. That's something where we as society recognize there are benefits from having ecosystem. And I'm not even going to go into all of the benefits that are there because there's a multitude. But we can decide how much do we need to devote to protecting the ecosystem in a particular location. So we will get to that question in doing these kinds of analyses. And you can also do set aside. So you can say, okay, if we don't have a value, we're not going to have a particular value. You can say, okay, in this basin, we're going to set aside 1,000 acres of ecosystem that we need to maintain, and use that as a constraint in doing these kinds of projects. And so what you do is you end up with figuring out what your shadow value is, what's the implied value of that ecosystem in the end when you do this kind of program. But I think that that's really kind of the way that you get to doing this kind of valuation, that it ends up being an indirect valuation by a consensus agreement within the community about what they want to do in terms of running these kinds of programs.
Great, thank you. A last call out there for questions or comments.
I see a hands up from Julia Grimm.
Great, Julia. Julia, did you have a question to ask? You might be on mute.
No, excuse me, for the finding the right button. No, I do not have a question. Thank you very much.
Okay. I see another question in chat. Has there been a consideration to study the cost of not accepting floodwaters for drought years, such as we are in now? In other words, farmers are receiving reduced water allocation. What is the frequency that this occurs, and what is the farmer's loss in yield?
I'm not sure I quite follow the question. I know that when we were looking at the study that was done by RMC in the Kings Basin, I believe the frequency of available floodwaters was 38%. But I've seen a range that actually varies by basin, how often floodwaters are available in wet years. You don't do recharge in drought years for obvious reasons, because there's no floodwaters available to, or very little in the way of floodwaters available to recharge your basin. You're really looking for availability of floodwaters in wet years like 2017, when we had a large amount of water that was available in different locations, and being able to divert that into the basin or into the growers' fields. There's also, I know that there's been some work looking at the loss of yield. The work I've seen has not come to a definitive conclusion that there is any loss in the yield of fields that accept floodwaters. I think there might be some issues if floodwaters come late in the spring. So, for example, if you have waters that are available in May or June, but there hasn't been a lot on this that points to potentially large yield losses, at least so far.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thanks for your time to participate in a LunchMAR. I'd like to invite the participants to give Richard a virtual high five by raising your hand, or a virtual round of applause to thank for his time. In the last couple minutes, we'll open up the mics if anyone has any announcements, upcoming events, potential requests for future LunchMAR topics, volunteers for future presentations. So we'll open it up. Please feel free to turn on your camera or unmute yourself, raise your hand if you've got any announcements you'd like to share with the group.
Yeah, and I just want to also add that I'm interested in hearing from some of the others in the survey, some of the answers where people had answers that were others in terms of things that they were doing with respect to some of the questions that we asked. A little bit more information about that would be interesting.
Yeah, great. We invite people to add that into the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. Mike, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody know the American Water Resources Association that I'm a member of, and I bet there's other members on the call. The upcoming Impact magazine that gets put out is going to be focused on California groundwater. And I'm going to log roll for Daniel a little bit. He and his colleagues have got a paper in about FloodMAR. So we're really excited to give it that national perspective, get the national perspective on it, and let everybody see what we're up to here. So I want all the FloodMAR folks to know that that's coming.
Great. Thanks a lot. Ajay.
Thank you, Jenny. Richard, very nice presentation. Thank you very much for giving this presentation. And, interestingly, you show that you have taken a little different approach, wherein you show when you're doing FloodMAR, you're doing it such that it has higher level of storage in the reservoir. When you say higher production of hydropower and more water stored in the reservoir. In our Merced study, we are doing a watershed study in the Merced River Basin. And in that, we are actually taking water out of the reservoir before the start of flood season and moving that water into groundwater storage and lowering the surface storage in a way, creating space to capture some flood flow. So we have taken a little different approach. It's just interesting to see, how you have. You're on mute.
I need to unmute. So I think that's similar to, it's actually quite similar to what I'm discussing, which is you can kind of take it two different ways, which is you can move water out and then allow more water to be captured without modifying the current flood control rules. But I'm not sure how much that in the end that actually increases the amount of water that you have available for storage in the end. Overall in time, because you have to move that water out before you actually know what the water year is going to be like. And so I'm suggesting that you actually need to modify the flood control rules, which is what FIRO is doing, which allows you in real time to decide whether you want to capture more water as it actually arrives. And so I think that that's really the big advantage that comes by having FloodMAR, because the on-farm FloodMAR is basically like increasing your reservoir capacity by a large amount, and it kind of that reservoir capacity, you can vary the size. You get to vary the size of your flood control space basically by how much acreage you enroll in the program from year to year, rather than having to build a big reservoir and build it for one size and pay for that for the next 50 years. You are able to more economically finance that kind of reservoir control. So that's kind of interesting. Which reservoir on Merced are you working with?
This is New Exchequer Dam, Lake McClure.
Okay.
Well, it's 1:30. I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. I'd like to thank Richard again as our speaker. We have approached 1 year of LunchMARs, so we appreciate your continued participation, and we certainly want to add value to the FloodMAR conversation. So any suggestions for moving forward, any changes you'd like to see in our LunchMAR presentations, just let us know. And thank you very much. We'll see you next month.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Very much, Richard.
Hey, Richard.
Great, thank you so much.